Hello and welcome to A Gentleman Talks, our series of one-to-one interviews with ladies and gentlemen where we talk about their work, their lives and their influences, all within our framework of our mission as the perfect gentleman to make the world a more respectful, stylish and gentlemanly place. And today I'm delighted to be talking to a good friend of ours, James Marwood. James, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
And James, I did as we always do, I did a little bit of research and went back and had a look at you,
Okay.
and it just strikes me you've had an extremely interesting life.
Yes, it's travelled around a bit. Yes.
Both in work and in your private life.
Yes.
So and other things that you do. So just let's start out just talking a little bit about what you actually do, what your day-to-day working life is.
So, I'm a self-employed management consultant. Would kind of be the generic title, but really what I do is I work with a mixture of very big companies who I can charge large amounts of money to, and very small companies and charities and one-man bands who I try not to charge anything to help them solve problems. Normally that's in the way of they've started to make a change and it's not gone right and they're struggling to get the benefits they want to really make it happen. So it could be something like a big company that's bought a big IT system and they're struggling to get it working properly and get their guys using it. Or it could be a little small charity that one of their guys is about to retire and they've got to think, what we're going to do now? You know, we need some help with planning the future and succession planning and thinking about that. So that's really what I do. I kind of come in and ask difficult questions and say, have you thought about this and have you thought about that, and try and get people thinking a bit. And sometimes it gets quite tense and upset, and generally at the end of it, it's successful and people like me, and then I go on and find the next thing.
So the headline position would be business change
consultant. Really, okay. That's what it is. But you know, I talk about this because I quite often go up against and I compete for work with some of the really big companies, so the really big consulting Big Four firms. And so what I tend to really focus on is the intersection, we call it, of people, policy, process and systems, IT. So a lot of what I do is translating between management and workers, or between IT and the business, or trying to break down some of the communication barriers that generally they build up over time. People get upset, people get entrenched in their ways of thinking. And sometimes it just takes someone with a bit of distance and a little bit of clarity to come in and just say, what about this? You know, why are you doing it like that? It often ends up with the client saying, well, I knew all that anyway. And it's like, well, you know you knew it now, but you didn't know you knew it when I came in. And that's a lot of what I do. It's really all about helping people solve their problems and getting through those big, thorny business problems.
And you must have seen some fascinating businesses in your time.
Yes. I mean, I've worked in a lot of big UK businesses. I work quite a bit abroad, doing a lot of work at the moment, for example, in Central Europe, which is a fascinating place to work because it's a mix of really fast-paced, fast-growing, really very entrepreneurial companies with a very technology sort of focus, but mated to really old-fashioned business practices, often sort of mandated by the state. So I was sort of bemoaning some of this just yesterday with a client and saying, why do we have to have these crazy rules? Why do I need all these pieces of paper? And he said, well, you've got to remember that it was only sort of 98, 99 that they actually allowed the banks not to keep handwritten ledgers.
Wow.
So you know, it's and yet at the same.
You're stepping back. In UK terms, you're stepping back.
Yeah. So
20 years.
For Western European or American companies, you know, you're going back 20 years, but yet they've got a sensibility and a desire to improve, which is really refreshing, which is something we don't necessarily always see in big companies here.
Right.
So that's something I really enjoy. I also do some work with very small charities. So one of the charities I work with called the Gun Dog Trust. They're a welfare charity for gun dog breeds, and they do events and so many things. And that was they were a client I worked with as a business, and we helped them move in to become a charity. And the thing I love about that is it's people really, really care. When it's something like that, it's not a big charity. It's not something with any money in it. It's not something that you're going to get to build a career around. It's just a subject matter that people really, really care about. And the other trustees there, really, they're so passionate about what they do and about the dogs and the owners and the sport. It's after going and working in a bank for 3 or 4 months,
right?
And having the opposite of that, or going and sort of turning around a failing call centre in Kuala Lumpur or something, and then you go and deal with these guys out in the country, and they're just like, right, we'll go and talk about this while we walk the dogs.
Literally a breath of fresh air.
Absolutely, it's wonderful. And then sort of the final string to my workboard that is something I really enjoy is I do a bit of work with young coders and developers and entrepreneurs, normally just for a couple of weeks a year, through organised events, and I go and do some mentoring. There's a group, for example, called Young Rewired State, who do really cool development work where they pair up under 18s, so anything from sort of 6-year-olds to 17-year-olds, with developers in a company somewhere in the UK, so it might be someone like BT or a big bank, and give them access to government data, so they get this through the cabinet office, and then they just say, just play and see what you come up with, and they do amazing things. Like a chap, a young guy I saw a little while ago, he was 15 and he'd been working on his own with a design agency in Cardiff, and just there for a week, 5 days, and with a little bit of help, but not a lot because it was only with a small company. And he'd taken together Department of Health information on how companies are, on the scores on the doors thing you get for restaurants.
Yeah.
Mashed that up with some information from Google and with some others, and he created an iPhone app that you could go in and see what's this restaurant's scores on the doors. And he was presenting this and telling it, and the chap from the cabinet said, that's interesting, because we gave the Department of the Environment something like £500,000 the year, and they said they couldn't do it. And he did it himself, and some 15-year-old kid did it himself with a week. And it's that sort of thing when it happens.
Fresh thinking again.
Absolutely, and it just blows all that way. And when you see that, that's just, and he was like, well, it's obvious, because he doesn't see the problems, and that's what I love about. So that sort of gets me through those dodgy bank board meetings and things. That's what makes the difference. Yes.
And what got you into that line of business? This line of business that you do?
It was entirely accidental, actually. I many years after I finished university, I had an abortive attempt at a career in an FE college. I was not a good fit there, and they politely pointed that out to me, and he suggested I go on my own way. And I needed a job quickly, so I got one in a call centre for a phone company. And second week, I was dragged into a workshop with a guy who, he had a smart suit and a nice car outside, and he just drew on the whiteboard and asked questions. And I thought, I could do that. That looks alright, I could do that. So I asked him, I said, like, how do I get to do that? And he's like, well, we need someone to come and help us a bit, so if you want to come and do it. I did that, and that's all I've done since then. So since being 21 to now I'm 36, that's all I've ever done is stand up in front of whiteboards and draw on them and try and persuade people to listen. So yeah.
And go back in. We're working backwards.
Yeah.
And your degree is an interesting one.
Yes. Well, my degree was a real mix. So I as a boy, I wanted to be a policeman. Really, right up until I was about 18, 19, and I met some policemen and thought, actually, they're not very happy. I don't think I'd like to do that. So I did a degree in criminology, and then mixed it with politics and some religion. And a little bit of third world studies. So it's all around sociology, people, how they do and why they do what they do. But the main focus on it was on crime. Looking at things like white-collar crime, organised crime, disorder, violence, that kind of thing. I've always been interested in people who act out and are a little bit different and are a little bit eccentric or a little bit unusual or act in different ways. And that was really where that started. That was a fascinating. It was an interesting place to study as well. I went to Middlesex University in North London, which is probably fair to say not one of the more prestigious of the UK's universities, but a really interesting place, and it has a very strong sort of soft left playwright type ethos, which rubbed me up entirely the wrong way my first sort of 6 months there, until I learned to settle down and listen. And it was interesting just listening to people who had an entirely different viewpoint to mine, people from all over the world, people who just had ideas I'd never even come across. And I think that was I probably learned as much from that as I did from the actual study, which was fascinating. That was also where I started doing the security work, which also taught me an awful lot about people and why they do what they do. So that was a.
So you started doing security work while you were at university?
Well, I was at university. Yeah, it was when I was 18, and I needed a part-time job to help pay my way through university, and it became I had a choice really of earning £3.50 an hour behind the bar or earning £4 an hour doing security. So I thought, well, £4 is better than £3. So I went to do that, and they gave me this terribly unflattering yellow jumper with security written on the back in big letters, and had me stand on a door outside a student union bar for 2 years, which I loved. It's absolutely great. I'm still friends with the guys I worked with. Still learnt a lot, and from there I moved on to doing more professional security work, pubs, nightclubs, prisoner escorts, close protection, all of that kind of stuff. But it all started with student union bars, and there's nothing quite as fun as a Tuesday night student union disco where everyone's a bit drunk and very flirty, and you get paid to be there.
Right.
There's no better job.
And you're sober and can watch it all going on.
Absolutely, yes. And being the sort of place at universities, aren't they, that you don't get the sorts of troubles and difficulties that you would get in a city centre bar, especially on a campus. You might get people a bit drunk or a bit boisterous or whatever. So there was the opportunity to learn and to develop almost the craft of dealing with people when they're not at their best.
Right.
That was a really useful environment for me. And I was quite lucky to have some good guys to mentor me while I was there. There's a principle in Japanese martial arts. There's a thing called a senpai kohai relationship of a senior man who takes a younger man under his wing and guides him and offers him advice. And he's not there in a leadership capacity, but as a mentor.
Right.
And it's quite an expected thing in Japanese martial arts and in Japanese business and things like that. And I was quite lucky to get a guy called Alan Grout, who was a real old school London doorman who'd been there and done it through the 60s, 70s and 80s.
Okay.
And
Interesting times,
and he'd done it in some of the worst parts of London and some of the best, so some of the most swanky West End bars and some of the East End dives and all sorts of places. And he taught me an awful lot, which was, that I often joke that he was probably the best tutor I ever had at university, because he taught me so much, not just in terms of martial arts, but in terms of how to act, how to be. His number one rule is be right, be fair. If you're right and you're fair, it doesn't really matter. And everything else will follow from that.
You stand behind that.
Absolutely. So long as you can justify what you do to yourself, everything else follows. And that is, especially in that industry, is so important. Because it's easy to be when you're the sober guy and you're turfing people out of bars and things. There is a temptation there to be a bit dark or to do things you shouldn't. And that ground rule of be right.
Yeah.
That's important. Yeah. So I learned a lot from Alan at that time.
What an interesting point. And we know you at the Perfect Gentleman. We know you for the work that you do with us, have done with us on Bartitsu.
Bartitsu, yes.
Which is a great name.
It is. It generally raises a few chuckles.
Yeah.
And it did even at the time. And Bartitsu was the first real sort of bud of Eastern martial arts being taught in Europe. So Europe had a long tradition of its own martial arts. That during the 18th and 19th centuries sort of settled down into fencing, boxing, wrestling, and the sorts of things that are taught, things like pentathlon, shooting, riding, running, swimming, that sort of thing. And these all grew out of military sports and training men for war and that kind of thing. But in the East, they had things like judo and jiu-jitsu as it was at the time. It was just turning into judo at that time. And a chap called Barton-Wright, E.W. Barton-Wright, who was an engineer, been an antimony smelter, a railway engineer, travelled all around the world getting in scrapes. He was a big chap, by all accounts bad-tempered, a bit rude, and he'd learned different pieces of martial arts. We talked about in South America fighting with staves, and then learning to fight with knives in Italy and things. But really, when he went to Japan and he studied jiu-jitsu, he seemed to realise that he hit on something. And so he came back to London, and he opened a gym on Shaftesbury Avenue, what's now the Shaftesbury Hotel, in the basement there. And he brought, which was probably another way in which he was really a pioneer, he brought together a number of very skilled instructors from around Europe and from Japan. He brought two Japanese guys over, young men, 18 and 21, Unishi and Tani. And he also had a Swiss stick fighter, master at arms, a Swiss wrestler. They taught boxing, all sorts of things there. But he called it Bartitsu, which was this portmanteau of mashing together his own name and jiu-jitsu. Right. And this raised a few eyebrows. There was a guy called Herman Kate, who was a Dutchman who'd studied jiu-jitsu at the same time as Barton-Wright, and they'd met each other on journeys. And he makes a couple of arch comments in his letters about this Bartitsu and sort of naming it the way he did. But it was the first time Eastern martial arts had been taught really in Europe. They'd been demonstrated before, but the first time it was really taught. And it was the first time that blended martial arts were taught. And it was also, I think, the first time that a really experimental system came about. And that's the way the Bartitsu Society, of which I'm a member, we tried to continue on that experiment. So Barton-Wright, by bringing together martial arts champions and putting them together in an environment that encouraged experimentation and cross-training and really testing each other, started to bring something great together. And unfortunately, it didn't succeed with Barton-Wright, because it seems he was not a particularly great businessman, and he was quite an unpleasant chap, and these guys all split and went their separate ways. But he really sort of foreshadowed the likes of Bruce Lee, or the modern self-defense or UFC movements, by the best part of a century. And very far ahead of his time, a little bit probably too far. And it would have been forgotten, but for a couple of chance things, such as the Sherlock Holmes connection, which is kind of where most people come to learn of it.
What's the British element then of Bartitsu? So if you take jiu-jitsu, the Eastern. So you had jiu-jitsu, the Eastern art, and there was boxing, which was a traditional sport. Most boys would have done it at school. Certainly, men of Barton-Wright's class would have boxed at university, right. Or certainly been exposed to it. And Barton-Wright talks a little bit about taking boxing back to its earlier roots, which was really about removing some of the restrictions in the Queensberry rules, for example. So taking it back to the earlier London prize rules, where you could grip people, you could trip them, you could do things that were a little bit more free, okay. But that you need to do in order to deal with jiu-jitsu the
fighting.
Practical and the practical situations of life, rather than taking someone off in a ring.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I think with that was quite interesting is, if you look at things like the mixed martial arts or the ultimate fighting now, and you see the way that boxers have been forced to adapt how they fight, because the rules are different, and you could stand there and try and squelch with someone like a traditional boxer, but against a wrestler or a judo guy, you'll get taken to the ground and have a hard time of it. They've had to adapt the way that they box in pretty much exactly the same way that these early boxers did, and in the way that Barton-Wright describes. So you get to this same idea of the way that of this very British style of fighting, sort of being reimagined and rediscovered by.
But a practical,
very
application
practical.
rather
very,
than
very practical.
competitive.
Absolutely. And boxing, even the most academic sort of amateur boxing is very, very practical. But it's just tweaking it and changing the mindset and changing the context. And in everything, in martial arts study or in life, whatever, context is key. So the way in which you apply it and the situations in which it's designed to be used, brought to bear, changes entirely the shape of it. So form really follows function, and that's really, I think, where Barton-Wright was so far ahead of his time, was he was able to recognise that, and unfortunately it didn't stick, and you ended up with this short-lived British Jiu-Jitsu movement, which was quite static and quite academic in its approach, and at the same time, judo that was coming out of, in Japan, the college students having these intramural competitions that the Professor Kano had taken and turned into judo and codified, and that became very popular in the UK, and that really drove out Bartitsu.
Right.
And I think, you know, the ideas that Barton-Wright had, and he didn't express very well, were far more subtle and far more complex than most people were ready for, I think, at the time. I think the level of understanding in martial arts circles, just people weren't ready for that then. He was so much of a pioneer, and it's something that we try in our own humble way to continue.
Right.
We're none of us the martial arts that certainly say Tani or Yunishi, the Japanese guys came over. Tani was at 18 taking on all comers in paid prize fights in music halls in London, and winning. He was, as far as we know, never defeated. And imagine an 18-year-old.
What period was this?
This would have been turn of the century, so 1901, 1902.
Right.
You know, so imagine a tiny little Japanese guy, 18 years old,
right,
in a music hall in the East End.
Right.
There's a shilling to anyone who could beat me, and no one did. So I mean, they gave him the rules a little bit, and they stacked the cards a little bit in his favour. But you know, he got up there and he got the mat and did it with anyone who happened to turn up, and you know. To try and stand in those shoes is a tall order, but we can try to continue on that work a little bit and try and bring a bit of it to life.
And you mentioned the Sherlock Holmes connection.
Yes.
And if anybody's recently heard of Bartitsu, it's highly likely that
almost
heard
certainly in
connection with that. So, my history's not that good. So when the Sherlock Holmes stories were being written.
Yeah.
How does that fit in terms of, was Bartitsu established at that stage? Or
it was. So Bartitsu was quite a craze at the time. It was really focused on high society. So you had guys like Baron Grenville, who was one of the founders of the British Olympic movement, was heavily involved in the Bartitsu Club, and there was this vision of the Bartitsu Club as a physical culture centre for ladies and gentlemen, so for people of the right sort of class, kind of thing. And then their enthusiasm has moved on, and that was. But for a time, it was very popular, and there were music hall exhibitions and newspaper articles and huge long discussions on the letter pages of newspapers about does it work, doesn't it work, things like that. Satirical articles. It was very much on the lips of people in London at that time, certainly. And then you had articles being published in Pearson's magazine, which was the same magazine that some of Conan Doyle's work had been published in.
Right.
And so Conan Doyle, when he needed a device to illustrate how Holmes was able to use his intellect and his skill to best Moriarty and save his life, he turned to what he misremembered as Bartitsu. Which is where the spelling mistake. The spelling mistake actually came, and we think it came from an article that was published around the times Holmes was writing Conan Doyle was writing the Adventures of the Empty House. That there was a typo in a newspaper article, and this for a long time no one really knew what Bartitsu was. There was a chap in the 30s in the Sherlock Holmes Society of New York picked up on it. And wrote an article, but that didn't go anywhere beyond that circle. And it wasn't really until a great old giant called Dickie Bowen, who was a martial arts historian, really sort of publicised this or picked up on it in I think in the 80s, and it became from there. It's grown, and then in the mid 90s, the Bartitsu Society or late 90s was formed on the internet, and it's just grown ever since then. And now that's it's more popular than it ever has been. Certainly more popular than there's more people training in it than there were in Barton-Wright's day. We've got in London there are 4 clubs at least that I know about, and every now and then I just hear of another one starting up. There's clubs all over the world. We've got a big event coming up at at the Beamish Open Air Museum in County Durham in September, which is fun because it's a Victorian themed event in a Victorian themed park, which will be great. We've got guys coming from all over the world to that, from the US, from South Africa.
That's all about Bartitsu.
All about Bartitsu, 3 days of Bartitsu.
Wow.
And I'm really looking forward to it. I'm quite excited. And it's in my hometown as well, so it's,
right.
yes.
And so when people see the latest Sherlock Holmes film, what will they see of Bartitsu? What will they review back and think of?
I mean, Robert Downey Jr. is a very experienced and very keen martial artist in his own right. He's doing his Wing Chun, a kind of kung fu, and interestingly, there are very similar stylistic similarities between Wing Chun and English boxing of a certain type.
Okay.
A lot of use of folding the arms and using the elbows and things like that. And there's possibilities that there could have been some cross-pollination because it was developed during the same time the British soldiers were in, British sailors were in China.
Oh, right.
But we don't really know too much about that. But but Robert Downey Jr. is very keen to show his Wing Chun skills, and Guy Ritchie is a very competent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy.
Okay.
And the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys will dislike me for saying this, but BJJ is basically judo taken in a slightly different direction. It grew out of judo, of a guy I believe called Kazumi, who was a Japanese diplomat who actually spent some time in London before he went to Brazil, and he so that there are their cousin relationships, if you like, between what the director does and luckily one of the other guys in the Bartitsu Society, one of the sort of the main driving forces, is a Kiwi called Tony Wolfe, and he is a fight director by trade.
Okay.
So he worked on the Lord of the Rings and quite a lot of things, and so he got in touch with the guy doing the fight choreography for the Sherlock Holmes films, and sent him some information and talked to him, and there's some little things that we see in there, but it's stage fighting. It's very well done. The fight scenes I think are fabulous in that film. I love it, and it's Bartitsu-ish.
Right.
Just a little bit. It's not. There's nothing you would recognise as canonical, but the spirit is there, and it's certainly there's a family relationship there, if nothing else.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, from the point of view of learning Bartitsu, and you did a lovely 2-hour session for us in one of our Perfect Gentleman sessions. I was struck by the fact that very little of it was actually about the sort of offensive.
No.
Most of the time you actually spent talking to the guys about how to avoid ever getting yourself to the point where you needed to use your learning. That's
the point. I mean, it's you know, I if you look at what the sort of things Barton-Wright wrote, he gave a lot of advice about how to protect yourself, to be aware, and you'd advise things such as walking in the middle of the road so that you wouldn't be surprised by someone jumping out at you. But in continuing on and building on what he's done, we've the advantage now of a lot more understanding in terms of psychology and human behaviour and things like that, and a lot of really the first rule of self-defense, which goes back to my very first sort of real practical martial arts instructor when I was 16 and training in Newcastle, and he said to me, first rule of self-defense is don't drink in the Blue Monkey, which was a famous bar in nearby Sunderland that was always on the news for being closed down by the police because of violence. And it was really about, you don't go where there's trouble. You stay, if you go to places that are known for trouble, you're probably going to get into trouble. So you go to the nice bars, or you don't take the shortcut through the park late at night. You walk the lit street a little bit round. Fairly common sense stuff, but especially for young men, that sometimes needs spelling out. I know certainly I was lucky as a young man that I got myself into some silly situations because of a bit of good luck and good friends. I got through them okay without any upsets, but there are an awful lot of the line we tread sort of between sort of the very comfortable, very peaceful life that we live, and the line that tips us over into having to deal in violence is quite a fine one, but it's something that you can manage really well by the decisions you make, the way in which you act, the things that you do, the people you choose to associate yourself with. It's one of the things that goes back to Alan, my old judo senpai, or my do senpai, who said, be right, and it's if you're mindful of your actions and you're mindful of your speech and you're mindful of where you go, you'll be safer.
Be right and be in the right place.
Absolutely, be in the right place, be in the right time.
Yeah.
But also be aware of what you're doing. One of the worst things you can do is what in self-defense circles gets called task fixation, but where you're so fixated on a task that you don't pay attention to your surroundings. So you're trying to juggle your mobile phone and get the cash out the cash point and look after the kid that's with you and all of that, and you're not aware. And that lack of awareness is something that a predator, someone who's looking to assault you, to take what you've got, either your dignity or your money, your possessions, whatever, will key on that and will see it as it's another little tick in the victim box.
Yeah.
And so being the sort of person who is visibly alert and visibly aware, that in itself is probably the most effective thing I can teach people.
Yeah.
Because that will stop things ever having to get physical.
No, I was really struck by it. I mean, two young boys myself. I something I'd be very keen for them to understand and to learn about before they get themselves in a situation where it's much learn it first rather than learn the hard way.
Of course, and sometimes people have to learn by mistakes. But if you can get, one of the things we talked about at the Perfect Gentleman event is what I call the stupid triangle. And it's a little bit like the fire triangle, where if you in order to have a fire, you need fuel, heat, and oxygen. And if you take one of those three things away, you don't have a fire. And if you go to stupid places with stupid people and do stupid things, you're probably going to get into trouble.
Yeah.
But if you take one of those three things away, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah. So
even if you are a bit as we all were, I certainly were, a bit stupid when I was 18 and had a couple of drinks and went out, so long as I didn't go to somewhere stupid, as long as I didn't go to the Blue Monkey, or as long as I stuck with my friends who were a little bit more sensible than me, at least on that evening, I was okay. Yeah. And the things go wrong when you have that confluence of the three stupids.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the difference, and especially for young men.
Yep.
Learning that.
Yes.
I think is,
and there's always that bravado and that
of
extra bit of testosterone going on. And
of course, yes.
If you don't actually have something set that that
and
pulls you back a bit.
Yeah, and I have. One of the. I remember a particularly foolish evening of mine when I was 19, my 19th birthday. In fact, and through a ridiculous series of events, I found myself outside at the back of a nightclub. My friends I'd lost them somewhere, and there's four great big hulking football guys wanted to fight me, and it's like, this doesn't seem nearly as much fun as it did half an hour beforehand. And luckily I was able to not get too badly hurt there and learn from it. But and that was just through silly bravado, a bit too much young man testosterone and beer. And so I was fortunate there. But if we can, especially teaching the guys who come to these events, just a little bit, to be a little bit smarter than I was, a little bit more astute, then they could not get themselves in quite so silly a situation.
And you've been to some really interesting places to train people on Bartitsu.
Yes,
so I read the University de Bourgogne. That sounds like quite a nice gig.
It's a fabulous place. Yes, Dijon in France. It's one of my favourite cities, and especially the university, because it's a big university. I was lucky enough to be invited to teach. There's a large historical European martial arts group that is one of the most active parts of which is at the university there.
Okay.
And they hold a big event, probably the biggest in Europe, every year, normally around Easter time. And I was lucky enough to be invited a few times to go and teach there. So I taught Bartitsu, practical self-defense, and military combat, sort of the slightly later adaptations of those martial arts for military use. And that was that was fascinating. That was because teaching, for example, I taught a self-defense class to a group of French university students who didn't have a whole lot of English, and I speak almost no French, and trying to explain to them that I want them to be really very aggressive and shouty and to really make a lot of noise and really sort of get a lot of force into what they're doing, and they're just looking at me a little bit confused.
Very relaxed.
Who is this strange English man sort of ranting at the front of the class and trying to get us to growl? And perhaps we could rather just go and sort of smoke clove cigarettes and talk about poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
But now, you arrived for the Perfect Gentleman event.
Mm-hmm.
Beautifully attired in it was the autumn, so the winter, so in a beautiful tweed suit. So
yes.
you dressed the part as well.
Well, everybody needs a hobby, and mine is suits, I guess. I was quite lucky growing up that I had a couple of role models. My granddad, my dad's dad, and my uncle, my mum's brother, were both very stylish men, very smartly dressed. My uncle especially, he'd worked most of his life in the clothing business, in high-end sort of menswear. And I rebelled against that for my teens, as young men I want to do. And it was really as I went into sort of my 20s and I started finding myself more and more comfortable wearing suits. And so that's what I do now. I'm lucky enough to have a good relationship with a couple of really good tailors who pander to me quite a bit and are happy to experiment with me. And so that's what I do. That's probably one of my biggest hobbies, probably my most creative, if you like, expression is clothes. I have far too many clothes. I have a regular debate with my girlfriend about what is a reasonable number of shirts for a man to own. Mm-hmm. She thinks about 15. I think somewhere approaching triple figures. But yeah, we're probably not
approaching triple figures.
Quite possibly, yes.
Okay.
Quite possibly, yes. Yeah, I actually have. I have two very, very large IKEA wardrobes.
I can imagine.
That are mine, and some stuff in storage and some others. I'm possibly a little bit of a hoarder when it comes to that. But there's just so many nice clothes out there that I can't. It is a hobby, and I'm there's a language and a skill to colour and to style and a history of it. And I'm very much a beginner, and I'm quite.
Except in shirts.
No, I have a lot of shirts. I'm probably more enthusiasm than skill in selecting shirts.
That happens to all of us.
Yes, but no, it's something again that I enjoy doing. But because I travel so much, and because I work with all sorts of different types of clients, and some of them want me to wear very formal suits, and some of them don't want me to wear a suit at all, what wouldn't be appropriate. Then so I have to have quite a varied wardrobe for that. But I always end up buying clothes on the spur of the moment because I'm travelling and I realise I need a.
Okay.
In fact, just this morning, I landed at Luton Airport and had got my suit out the boot of the car and realised I hadn't brought cufflinks, so I had to stop en route and get some cufflinks, which it was a nice little. Then there were some nice shirts there as well. So
And so when you started, when you moved out of your teenage years and decided that you were gonna have a suit, how did you as a young man, how did you start?
Well, I started as most young men do, and actually probably the best place for them. I was quite lucky. I went to Marks and Spencer's. It's as much as it gets a knock for being stodgy. I don't think that applies to its suits. M&S has a great supply chain. It gets really good material, and it has some really good designers. Richard James, who's sort of one of the biggest names, sort of just off Savile Row, he designed some suits for them, which are great.
Okay.
And I was lucky enough. Again, my uncle advised me to just get it altered a little bit. Just take it to an alterations tailor, and get the waist nipped in a little, and the sleeves shortened. And what I found is that something like 80-90% of the suits that are sold off the rack in the UK are made by the same company, Bowen and Bowen, who are they have factories all over Central Europe and I think the Far East, and they're a great company. But what it does mean is that you could go to Harvey Nicks and spend £2,000 on a suit, and it's probably been made on the same production line by the same guys as your £300, £200 Marks and Spencer suit.
Yeah.
And the Marks and Spencer's one probably has a little bit less flair in the design and a little bit less stylistic tendencies, but that just means it doesn't go out of fashion as quickly, and it's probably made from better material. So, so what I was lucky enough to be able to discover was that if I bought a suit like that and budgeted about 10% for alterations and got the trousers taken up, and make friends with an alterations tailor. That's one of the most important life lessons.
Right.
Yeah, if good tailors are worth their weight in gold, especially if you run in there on a Friday night and say, I need these trousers tonight, but I need them this much shorter.
You need to have a good relationship.
You need that good relationship. Right. And from there I experimented with a few tailors until I found one that I could afford, that the price was right, and that I liked. You know, tailors, you could go on to Savile Row and spend thousands of pounds, and hopefully at one point in my life, at some point, I'll be able to do that, and I'll be able to do it, but I can't now.
Yeah.
But instead I use a very good city tailor, a firm called Graham Brown, and they're great. You know, they're fun, they like to experiment, but it's true British bespoke tailoring in a way that you don't really get anywhere else. There's the Italians do very good tailoring, and the French do some magnificent stuff, but there's really nowhere quite like London city tailors who do this very good product at a very reasonable price with so much fun and so much passion in it.
Right.
You know, I go into my tailors for a fitting, and I'm just going to be in there 20 minutes, and I'll be in there hours, just talking and laughing and real characters.
It's a great thing to be able to say, I'm going down.
I'm just popping into my tailor.
My tailors. It's like my club or something like that. It's something that we all aspire to.
It is, and it's surprising
that
when
relationship.
One of the lessons I think that I got from especially as a younger man, and where I had a little bit less money, was that you can, if you save or you buy less things but better quality, they last better, they fit better, you love them more, and you end up looking that much better. And it means that, maybe I can only buy one good suit a year, or maybe I can only buy one good suit every 2 years. But as long as I look after it, and I keep it clean, and I don't send it to the dry cleaners every week, and I brush it when I take it off, and hang it up carefully and take it up, it'll look great. Especially if I get it, in a good Yorkshire wool. It'll look great for 10 years, and it'll look fine for 20 years, and I can probably still wear it for third best or for Sunday afternoons for 20 years after that.
Yes.
Whereas if you compare that to
an investment,
it is an investment. As long as you stay the same sort of size.
Yes.
But a tailor can help with that as well. But yes, my tailor keeps having to move buttons for me in and out as it goes. But if you compare that to, say, like I've spent money that I really regret on very fashionable trendy suits, and because they're fashionable and because they're very obviously styled, they look out of fashion very quickly. The material's rarely very good, the cuts rarely great, so it looks wonderful on the peg in the store. It looks great on the model who's wearing it on the thing, but then you realise that all his clothes are pinned at the back, and they've altered them and adjusted them to fit him. And that's why I think there's no substitute for a proper bespoke tailor, where you go in and try it on several times, and they adjust, and you have a relationship, and they learn to over time to get it just how you like it.
And I know, because you and I have met very recently, you have the same attitude towards your shoes as well.
Shoes, yes. Well, I'm yes. There's a chap, a friend of mine, a guy who writes a really, probably the biggest style blog in the world now, Permanent Style, called Simon Compton. He always advises to budget around 10 to 15% of the value of your outfit for your shoes. And he gave me a piece of advice which was really simple. If you have an extra £50 or £20 or £100 in your budget for an outfit or for some clothes, spend it on the shoes, because that will make the difference. And so, I'm not that there are some fabulous shoemakers in London who will hand make you a bespoke pair of shoes, and I'm not able to afford that yet.
No.
But I can go and press my nose up against the glass of Cleverley's or somewhere like that, and enjoy watching them, seeing them. I can aspire to them. But there are a number of good quality Benchmade shoe manufacturers in the UK, and you can get these actually all of it, sometimes they crop up in again M&S. You know, as long as you have something that is, if it says it's made in Northampton, chances are it's probably a good pair of shoes.
Yeah.
And again, it'll last you. I think we talked about my first really good pair of shoes that I bought myself when I was 24 and I'd moved to London, and I got my first paycheck for a reasonable amount of money, and I bought this pair of shoes, and I felt sick with myself. You know, how can you spend so much money on shoes? You know, it was about the equivalent of you know, sort of 3 weeks shopping at Sainsbury's, and I still have them. You know, 12 years later, I still wear them on a regular basis. They've been resold twice, and they still look great.
Yeah.
You know, and they're so comfortable, and they're so. But they'll last me as long as I keep walking in them. They'll keep going.
Yeah.
And that, you know, so that £100 I'd forgotten about that. I spent on them all those years ago, but you know, there is that thing about. You know, quality is what remains when price is forgotten, and I think that is very true.
And then we're both now sharing the
Yes.
services of the wonderful Stephen at the Hilton on Park Lane.
Yeah, I'm actually going there later, so he's going to rescue these shoes from me. He is. You know, one of the things I love, that's the thing about the work I do. I love to work with people who are passionate about their business, and I've never met anyone. You know, and someone who polishes shoes with his bare hands, because that's the best way to get the pigment into the leather.
Yeah.
And he's so passionate and cares so much about it, and the quality is like, you know, you come out of a shoe shine and you walk along looking at your shoes because they just look so great. And I had this, actually went from seeing Stephen when we met the other week, and I popped into to Churches on Jermyn Street because they had a sale on, and as soon as they opened the door, they go, "Oh wow, you've looked after those well." And it was like, and I was tempted. I was like, "Oh, well, I could say yes. It's actually no. There's a chapter in it for me."
Yeah.
But yes, and the other guys were all looking at the shoes and how he'd done them, and yeah, he's a craftsman.
He really is. And when you see some of the things he's done with shoes that you just imagine were ready for the bin.
Well,
then
we saw your before and after on your suede shoes that looked
extraordinary.
Turned a 10-year pair of shoes into they look new.
They got better because, as he said they would, as they dried, as they dried out, then they got better. I looked at them the other evening because I haven't worn them since but they're like a new pair of shoes again. But I looked at them.
But that's the advantage of buying quality and then learning to take care of things. Yeah. You know, it's something that I learned. My granddad taught me when I was a boy how to polish shoes. And I don't know any of the skill of someone like Stephen, but at least just how to apply a couple of coats of polish and how to buff it up and look after your shoes. And I love, normally I aim to do it every week. It normally ends up being once every 3 weeks. But my Saturday morning, get up early before anyone else in the house. Sit downstairs, get my shoes out.
Therapeutic.
And it's meditative. It really is. It's absolutely lovely. And there's something, I don't know, especially for someone like me, you know, I don't do work with my hands. I don't get to make things. And I rarely actually get to see the finished product of what I do because I come in and change someone's direction and then leave them. And there's something about taking that scuffed, scabby pair of shoes that you've been wearing all week. Like at the moment I'm working in Poland, beautiful cities but cobbled, dusty streets. Nightmare on your shoes. And there's something about just half an hour with a brush and a cloth and a little bit of polish, making it all better again is very therapeutic. Yeah.
James, as I knew we would, 45, 50 minutes just hasn't been enough.
Yeah.
It's flown by, but also we've just touched on the surface of so many things. But we're gonna move on now. We're gonna do the perfect gentleman's 10 questions.
10 questions. Okay.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the perfect gentleman's 10 questions. So, James, what embodies a gentleman for you?
I think for me it's thoughtfulness. You know, there's lots of trappings and things you can do to call yourself a gentleman. You know, dress well, follow the rules of manners, of etiquette, you hold doors, that sort of thing. But really, it all boils down to being thoughtful of how you act and the effects that your actions have on others. That to me is showing, having care and consideration for those you interact with, looking to leave the world better because you were in it. That to me is really what a gentleman is for.
Excellent. What's the most romantic thing you've ever done?
Well, funny enough, I was talking to my girlfriend about this on the phone today, because I was thinking of, and I've done some crazy overblown stuff, like I bought the entire contents of a flower shop to give to my girlfriend.
Okay.
On our second date. Yeah. Or I booked out a cinema because she wanted to see a film, and I had a friend who managed a very nice old Art Deco cinema, so I booked out the whole cinema for us to have the front. And I was thinking about maybe something like that. And what she said, the thing that sticks in her mind was when she was working on a market in East London, and I was in an office in the city, and the weather turned, and I knew she didn't have the right clothes with her, and I went out and bought her a scarf and gloves and hat, and got in a cab and went up and gave them to her, and that's what she remembers. So that, I think, is probably the most romantic thing.
That's what she remembers. That's up there.
That's it.
If you could bring one gentlemanly trait into business, what would that be?
I think reflection, taking time to reflect and think on what you're doing. A lot of, both in terms of how you act, the decisions you make, and how you communicate. I think a lot of the problems that I come in and try and solve are driven by haste and not really thinking through the ramifications of what you do, and then being unwilling to go back and examine them. And so that, I think, a gentleman should be mindful of the effect he's had and be willing to reflect on it. And I think that's something that business could really do with.
Excellent. What element of grooming is important to you?
Oh, crikey. Well, you could say the basics, just be clean.
Right.
But I think for me, the thing that I value most is shaving. I love to have just that morning ritual of a shave with a safety razor and a badger brush and a shaving. That's what I love to do pretty much every morning. That just sets me up for the day. Gives me just that 5 minutes to think and prepare, and it's meditative. It really is. Just being able to, just very quickly. You can't do it quickly, so it forces you to slow down. It forces you to think.
Right.
That's what I love.
Excellent. Okay, name an iconic gentleman.
Now, I was having a think about this actually, and there's a guy who, a controversial choice, but possibly suitable for the day given its Independence Day, an American, A.J. Drexel Biddle Jr. A.J. Drexel Biddle Jr., who was a wealthy socialite, or the son of a wealthy socialite. He was a very keen martial arts. He was a real pioneer in the world of martial arts, especially in the military use of it. Also a phenomenally stylish man, probably one of the 20th century style icons, one of the real greats. But he did so much with his life. He enlisted in the US, I think, Marine Corps as a private, and left as a captain. He was a diplomat. He was a sort of charming man about town. He was this sort of almost a Renaissance man in that form, in that he embodied so many different skills and did them all 100%, and seemed to have an awful lot of fun doing them. So he's someone I look up to, especially the way he dressed. He was fabulous. So.
What's the most important item in a gentleman's wardrobe?
A suit. Nothing else quite like a suit.
Okay. Why should there be more gentlemen in the world?
I think it comes back to why, what does a gentleman do? What is it for? And it's not as much as we have fun with it about the suits or anything else. It's about leaving the world better than you found it, about caring about others, and that's what a gentleman. That's why we need more gentlemen, especially more young gentlemen. It's easy for young men to be painted as a group as being brash or uncaring, and actually you and I both know that's not the case, because we know some really very fine young men, and that is, that bringing that out of people and saying, it's okay, it's good to be a gentleman, and that is valued and useful for society. That's why we need them.
What key skills should every young gentleman be taught?
I think a lot of things, but one of the basics is the ability to look after yourself and those around you, to take responsibility for your own safety, not rely on that of others, and to make sensible decisions about how you act and understand that there are consequences to those. The basics really of what I teach in self-defense courses.
What should a gentleman never be without?
I'd have to say a pocket handkerchief or some sort of handkerchief. It's so useful, and you can do it. It's an incredibly good way to talk to ladies, especially if you're a young man. If you're in a restaurant and there's a table with some crumbs on it, and you give it a quick bite with your handkerchief before a lady sits down, guaranteed to start a conversation. It's also in almost everything you do can be made easier if you just have a little square of white cotton or linen.
Excellent. Okay, and finally, finish the sentence. A gentleman should always...
think of others first.
Wonderful. James, I knew it would be. We could go on for ages and ages, and I hope we might even come back and do this again one
I would
day.
love to.
But thank you very much. It's been a really great pleasure.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks. Thank you.